I'm Dr. Alyssa Reingold, and I'm a clinical psychologist at the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center. And in collaboration with the STEM Center for Strength, I'm here to present to you on restoration and resilience. So, my goals today are to talk a little bit about what is stress and anxiety. So, we're going to talk a little bit about defining those things, causes of them. We're going to learn how stress and anxiety can threaten our health. And then we're going to go in and talk about some very concrete, specific tips on things you can do to increase your personal resilience. So, first, before we talk about resilience and restoration, I just want to go back and define stress. Stress is not something necessarily bad. It really all depends on how we take it. Sometimes stress can be exhilarating and it could create creative work. Deadlines in my job causes me a bit of stress, but it gets me to be productive. But too much stress can sometimes be detrimental. I haven't met a single person out there that has said, no, no stress in my life, everything's great. So, more than not, most people experience stress in their day to day life. Now, I like this definition of stress that stress is a condition or a feeling that's experienced when a person perceives that the demands exceed the personal and social resources that individual is able to mobilize. Okay, so stress is a balance between our demands and then what we bring to the table, both our personal resources and our social resources. So when our demands outweigh those personal and social resources, we experience more stress. And it's learning how to balance those things. We can feel less stress by decreasing those demands, right? And we may, if only I didn't have to do X, Y, and Z, if only this didn't happen to me, I'd feel less stress in my life, decreasing the demands. However, we don't always have control over that. And so, if we don't have control over those demands, so for instance, this pandemic, we don't have control over all the things that are going on around us, right? But we do have control over our personal and social resources. And so, there we need to fill those up even more to meet those demands where they're at. This is why two different people that may be experiencing similar demands in their life may experience different levels of stress because of what they bring to the table to balance or what other demands they may have on their plate as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit then today. If we can't decrease the demands, the stressors in our life, what can we do to bolster, to fill up our personal reservoir of resources to meet those demands? Now, I want to talk a little bit about anxiety because anxiety goes hand in hand with stress at times. And anxiety is a feeling or response to a stressful event. Anxiety can be experienced as physical sensations of fight or flight. They could also be feelings of apprehension, nervousness, or fear. And anxiety is normal, it's understandable during situations of uncertainty. So we want to cut ourselves some slack that sometimes anxiety is normal. Actually, anxiety can be adaptive as it can help us prepare. But too much anxiety can interfere with our ability to cope. And that's where we need to sometimes keep our anxiety in check or work on ways to manage some of it. Now, underlying mechanisms of stress can come from a number of different places. It can come from, as I mentioned before, that anxiety is tied to our fight or flight response, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that response can bring on sort of a high stress response. But when we experience stressors over long periods of time, we can develop sort of burnout and exhaustion based on sort of what's called an general adaptation syndrome. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And also bear in mind that our perceptions about situations, so we're experiencing a stressor, but our thoughts and perceptions can add to that level of feelings of stress as well. So when we experience a dangerous situation, or perceive a dangerous situation, our body goes into what's called fight, flight, or freeze response. It's an automatic response. Our sympathetic nervous system immediately kicks in and goes through a bunch of physiological processes to prepare our body to physically fight the danger, physically run, flight, or freeze, sort of play possum. And this is adaptive. It's sort of a normal response to danger. It's actually was been passed down evolutionary from us. So back in the day, cavemen's walking around, sees a saber-toothed tiger. The cavemen that are going to survive are the ones that are going to physically fight that saber-toothed tiger or run or play possum, right? The ones that are like calm and collected and like, oh, look, it's a saber-toothed tiger. They're going to get eaten. So very adaptive that our body does this. Now, when our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, what happens is we tend to take in more oxygen for more energy to prepare itself to fight. So we tend to take shorter breaths to get more oxygen in. Our heart rate tends to increase. Blood is pumping through our body to the large muscle groups. Blood is flowing away from our smaller muscle groups and our extremities, like our fingers, for instance, our stomach, and it's preparing itself to fight. Very adaptive in dangerous situations. However, our body can kick in this fight or flight response to go into this mode even at times that aren't in the moment actual physically dangerous, but our body is perceiving the situation as dangerous and it could kick in the same response. So thinking about or worrying about dangerous situations in the future, worrying about just general negative events, or thinking about past negative events can kick in the same fight or flight response. But we're not physically running, physically fighting when that happens. And so what happens is then our body is stuck with those physiological reactions. Our sympathetic nervous system is just kicked in. We're taking shorter breaths. Our pulse is increased. Our heartbeat's racing. Maybe we feel sweaty. Maybe we feel tingling in our fingertips. Maybe we have an upset stomach. And these are just sort of these physical consequences of this fight or flight response because we're not physically doing anything and then we're feeling these physical reactions. Those are the physical reactions of anxiety. Sometimes for some people, those sensations themselves can feel uncomfortable and can feel threatening. And then we have additional thoughts that something bad is happening to us because we're feeling this way, and it can spiral even more. And just for some people, full-blown anxiety attacks, when in fact this whole process is normal in our body, but we're perceiving it as not. That's kind of what's going on. Our body's just kicking in this fight or flight response when we're not actually experiencing danger in that moment. Now, when we experience stressors and we kick in this alarm response, this fight or flight response, and that happens kind of over and over and over again, our stress response defends itself. Okay, so this is just sort of a picture of uh, when we experience a stressful event, our alarm reaction, we mobilize, right, our resources. And so the stressor occurs. And when that happens in that moment, our stress resistance decrease because we're preparing ourselves, right, for the situation. But if we're exposed to a stressor over and over and over again, cortisol is being released over and over again, our body actually starts to become more resistant to the stress. And so we kind of hit phase two, resistance. We start to cope with the stressor. We're expecting it, and our body kind of goes on autopilot resistance mode. However, it can only do that for so long. And then eventually we will get depleted of those resources and we will start to feel exhaustion. And for some people, burnout. So for some individuals who work in a very high stress job, they might be able to cope and resist the stress on an ongoing basis for long, but if they don't fill up their reserves and those get depleted to manage the demands, they might burn out and get exhausted. During this pandemic, I've seen this happen early on, a lot of heightened anxiety and worry. We start to become a little resistance to the stress around us. People start to adapt and cope. But then as it's gone on and on and on, we start to get exhausted and fatigued. And we really need to be intentional about filling our reserves up to manage that ongoing stress in our life. If we don't, we know that stress can impact our health. Stress is associated with heart disease, immune system problems, headaches, IBS. It can impact mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And then it can also impact our behaviors, which then can impact our health. So stress can impact, some people tend to cope with stress with unhealthy coping strategies like drinking, smoking, or eating. All coping strategies, but kind of unhealthy ones. And then those unhealthy coping strategies can then lead to more health problems. So during this pandemic, my 13-year-old daughter has coped by baking a lot. Very healthy, right? Just getting her active, doing something, focusing her attention. However, one of my coping strategies is eating her baking. Kind of okay a little bit. It gives me a bit of comfort, but the more I eat, the more then that impacts my health. I've gained about 10 pounds during the pandemic, right? And so that's kind of impacted my health and well being. Now, resilience is the process of adapting in the face of adversity or significant sources of stress. Resilience is not bouncing back to how we were once, it's learning how to bend and adapting as adversity comes our way. Resilience is ordinary, it's common, it's not necessarily something extraordinary. It's not a trait that we're born with, it's something we can learn. Being resilient does not mean we're not experiencing difficulty or distress. So I can still feel distress and be resilient at the same time. So it's not the absence of feelings of distress, it is learning how to cope and manage it as it comes. And what works in one situation might not work in another. So it's also being flexible in our approaches and how we cope. So, how do we build and foster resilience? There's lots of different ways, and what works for one person might not work for another person, and what way have worked for you once before might not work now. And so sometimes it's about building up what used to work for you, building on your strengths, or maybe learning some new ways to cope and manage given different circumstances. So let's talk a little bit about a few ways to build or foster resilience. One way is talking to others. So we do know that social support is important to foster resilience. And so leaning on social support can be very adaptive and helpful. Talking to others can be helpful. Taking regular breaks. So if you're experiencing a significant amount of stress, our concentration can be impacted. And taking regular breaks can kind of reset that. um, During this pandemic. Working virtually, our work environment has shifted and changed, so taking regular breaks may be helpful. Using relaxation strategies can be helpful to foster resilience. So, relaxation can be breathing types of relaxation, progressive muscle relaxation, guided visualizations, or even mindfulness strategies, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Value driven behaviors can build and foster resilience. So sometimes clarifying what's important to you, clarifying your values, identify what gives you meaning, what gives you purpose in life, and then commit actions towards those values. So, for instance, during this pandemic, early on, I wanted to clarify to myself what gives me meaning and purpose as I'm kind of muddling through the pandemic. Well, supporting restaurants and small business was something that gave me a little bit of meaning. And so I, with intention, bought takeout twice a week as a way to give back to the community. Didn't really help my coping strategy of eating necessarily, but it was a way that I felt connected and felt a little bit of sense of meaning and purpose on those days when I ordered takeout. So identifying for yourself doesn't have to be related, like I said, to this pandemic, but just in general, What kind of gives you meaning? What gives you purpose? That might have shifted over time. So clarifying that, and then trying to commit to some actions each day towards those values. That can foster resilience. Using humor can foster resilience. Figure out ways to build humor, a little bit of humor into your day. So I have a colleague and friend that we send memes, just silly memes, silly sort of gifs to each other throughout the day. It's just to lighten the mood at times. So it's figuring out ways you can build humor into your life. Gratitude practice can also be a way to foster resilience. So each day, we often go through the day and we aren't necessarily aware of the things that are important in our lives that occur. And so figuring out ways to kind of practice gratitude, to notice the small things we're thankful for, to notice the small things in our life that often go amiss, and to just take pause to have gratitude towards those. That could be real small things like I'm grateful this morning I was just able to take a few minutes to kind of read my young adult fiction books that I like to read, and then I had a little bit of time to do that. I was grateful for that this morning. So, what are you grateful for today? Even if it's a small little thing, and creating some time in your day to notice, whether that's at the end of the day, having a gratitude journal that you could just jot down one thing every day that you noticed in that day that you were grateful for. Resting and eating healthy is important to foster resilience. So, sleep, eating, and then exercise at the bottom here are all kind of essential ways to kind of build your personal reservoir to balance off the stressors that come your way. And I'll talk about getting restful sleep in just a minute. But those are essential. If we're not sleeping well, we don't have good concentration, our memory's off, we're irritable. And so making sure we're tending to that is important. Scheduling pleasant activities can help bolster resilience. Whether it's as small as I mentioned, kind of reading a little bit of a book for 15 minutes, whether it's making a cup of tea, whether it's sitting on my porch drinking my cup of tea, just small pleasant activities each day can foster resilience. Even at times during adversity, building a little bit in can go a long way. As I mentioned, exercise is important as well. It releases endorphins, it helps our body feel better. Keeping a normal schedule. When we're under a lot of stress, sometimes we can throw our schedule off and then that can stress us out even more. So keeping a normal schedule is very important. If you have kids, having them keep a normal schedule as well, that helps with expectations. It helps our body kind of decrease some stress knowing what to expect. I'm going to jump down here to journaling. Journaling is one way for some people to kind of express themselves, to get their thoughts and feelings out. It's just one tip to sort of jot down the things that stress you out, vomit of the pen onto a piece of paper, especially at night. If you worry and have a hard time falling asleep, just write it all down, get it out. Can be helpful to manage stress. And then the last thing is if stress is overwhelming, if you're feeling a whole lot of anxiety that gets in the way of your day, seeking counseling can be a good resource to kind of help you develop an individual plan to foster your own resilience and give you some tools to manage when you're feeling overwhelmed. So I'm going to go into detail of a few skills to talk about in building your own resilience. And so sleep health, as I mentioned, really important. If we're not getting good sleep, it is really hard to focus on other things in our life. And so establishing a sleep schedule, limiting daytime naps. So if you're having trouble falling asleep and not getting good sleep, and then you nap to try to make up for it, there is really no makeup in sleep. And all that does is impacting your next sleep cycle. So I'd encourage you, if you're having a hard time sleeping the night before, to limit those naps in the daytime, so that way your body can try to reset and get back on a sleep cycle. Reducing alcohol is also important if you're struggling with sleep. So sometimes people say, oh, a glass of wine helps me fall asleep at night. However, unfortunately, alcohol can interfere with that sleep cycle and not give you the full restful sleep. Uh, during the night. So trying to reduce alcohol can actually help you get a more restful sleep. Same with eliminating caffeine in the afternoon and the evenings can also and that too much of that can interfere with your sleep cycles, and so limiting that can be helpful. Increasing your exercise can also help your sleep. However, you don't want to exercise right before bed because then that can make it difficult for you to fall asleep. So doing that a few hours before sleep. And then lastly, sort of cultivating relaxation before bedtime by doing something calming. So creating a sense of calm, a routine in the evenings before bed can help you kind of your body settle, know what to expect. Limit your screen time right before bed. So I would not advise be surfing the web on your phone in bed before sleep or watching TV. So turning the screens off um, before bed because that can interfere with your ability to fall asleep and stay asleep. If you need some noise to fall asleep, I encourage you to either listen to music or have a sound machine play that's on a timer, so as a way to help you kind of fall asleep if you need it. Other ways to foster resilience is to ensure that social support is there, right? Talking to others is really important. We have to be creative during this pandemic with the vaccines coming out now. That's been really nice to hopefully we see kind of an end in sight. But sometimes we have to be creative despite the physical distancing during this pandemic, especially for those that might have to quarantine. And so we need to foster healthy connections. That can be by phone, that can be porch time, distanced. It could be, I think we're all sort of zoomed out, but maybe you be a little bit more creative in your Zoom and your Zoom can be pet sharing or other types of activity or exercising, doing a Zoom class together with somebody. As I mentioned, sharing silly memes and videos with each other and just snail mail. Everybody likes to get a letter in the mail, so some basic snail mail can also be a good way to kind of connect. For me, I early on in this pandemic, Marco Polo is another app where you could just send each other videos. And my sister lives in New York and she has two young kids. And I've had the opportunity, we do Marco Polo where her kids send me videos throughout the day. I send them back. They send me a lot of videos. But it's been a really nice way to connect to them. I show them what's going on in my house, our house projects. They show me the stuff that they've been doing. And actually, I've connected with them more now than I did before the pandemic because before the pandemic, maybe I'd FaceTime with them maybe once a week and they'd kind of jump on the screen and go run away. And this is just a way that we can send little quick videos to each other. So trying to get creative in how to stay connected. Now, what we think is very much relates to how we feel and very much relates to what we do. And so, one way, if you're feeling a lot of stress in your life, right, and anxiety, I can't directly tell you, just don't feel that way, right? We don't sometimes have control over how we feel, but we do have control of our perceptions, what we think about situations, and we do have control over what we do. And sometimes working on those two things can impact how we feel. So just kind of changing, reframing our thoughts, maybe focus on more helpful thoughts can be useful, just tweaking them slightly, and that might impact how we feel. We also might focus on and accept sometimes in situations one's lack of power, right? We need to accept things that we don't have control over and then shift to the things that we do. We can use relaxation techniques to help calm our body down, and then we can also use mindfulness based techniques. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mindfulness. I know mindfulness has gotten it's sort of a buzzword in sort of pop culture over the past decade, and a lot of people use it. I'm going to be mindful, but I think it's often been misconceived in how people go about. Mindfulness is just a way of being present in our day-to-day lives. It's learning how to be awake, how to truly foster being in the present moment and having true gratitude for each moment. And few of us ever live in the present moment. So we are often thinking about remembering the past, what has gone on, uh, conversations, experiences, ruminating about things that have happened to us, right? Or we are anticipating what is to come, planning for the future, worrying about the future, and our brain is always in those two modes, and we often are not in the present. And mindfulness is learning how to quiet our mind of the past and the future and being here in moment. When we're in the past and the future, we're missing out on this moment right here, right now of living. And mindfulness is learning how to pay attention on purpose, without judgment, in the present moment. And so if you're willing, we're going to do a little bit of a practice exercise to help you better understand just some of these concepts of mindfulness. This is taken from Siegel. It's just a little exercise where we're just going to notice our feet, okay? And so if you're willing to just get comfortable in your chair and just take a moment, put both feet on the floor. If you can gently close your eyes and just let your mind start thinking about your feet. Start thinking about how your feet carried you a distance today, where they've taken you, walking, driving, sitting. Maybe compare one foot to the other, noticing any judgments or evaluations, seeing whether you like one foot or the other. Maybe you notice worries about your feet, sensations, any future-oriented thoughts about your feet. I need to schedule a pedicure. And just take a moment to continue to think about your feet and just let anything come to mind. And now I want you to pay attention to your feet in a different way, slightly different. I just want you to start to be aware of the sensations of your feet. So just notice the sensations in your shoes, pressing against the floor. Notice the sensations between your toes. Maybe notice moisture, heat. Your feet in your shoes. Maybe you notice throbbing. Just let any sensation come and notice them. All right. Now I'm going to ask you to stop and pause. You can open your eyes if you had them closed and just take for a moment and notice these are just two different ways of experiencing your feet. We're thinking about our feet and we had focusing on our sensations of our feet. Mindfulness takes all of that into account. It's focused on directly feeling what you're going through, noticing the thoughts about experiences. It's just about being present and noticing that. So the purpose is to have a different relationship with our experiences. Our feet were mundane, right? But what if it was about emotions? Our goal is not trying to push pain away, but creating more room to be present with it. For some in this exercise, they might have noticed more sensations in their feet, or maybe noticed throbbing or something, moisture, heat. We didn't create that in this exercise. That was already present. Your feet were already experiencing it, but we just became more aware of it and focused our attention on it. Really, that's what mindfulness is about, is when we focus and pay more attention, we become much more heightened aware of our surroundings and our experiences, and allows us to experience more in each day and moment. It makes the mundane more richer. Again, our feet were pretty mundane. Now, for some doing that exercise, your mind might have wandered and it was really hard for you to tend to and focus on your feet. And that's okay. Our mind is going to wander when we try to focus. And we don't want to beat ourselves up and have judgment thoughts about the attempt at doing this. That just adds more, right? We just notice there's my mind wandering and just gently return. It takes practice. Mindfulness is actually a practice. So, mindfulness is simply being aware of what is happening right now without wishing it were different, enjoying the pleasant without holding on when it changes, which it will, being with the unpleasant without fearing it will always be this way, which it won't. So, I'm going to ask us, we're going to practice again. There's lots of different ways to engage mindfulness in your day-to-day life and in practice. So we're going to do kind of a more basic breathing mindful exercise. So if you're willing, gently close your eyes. And if you do decide to keep your eyes open, focus it on just one specific area so you're not too distracted by the sights around you. And just take a moment just to focus on your breath. Just start to notice each inhale and each exhale. Observe perhaps your chest rising and falling. Maybe you notice cool air with each inhale and warm air with each exhale. Our goal is not to change our breath, but maybe you notice your breath changing. Just observe sensations in your body with each breath. Maybe your stomach expanding and contracting. You are here in this moment, just breathing. And your mind may wander. That's okay. No judgment. You could just say to yourself, ah, there's my mind wandering. And gently return to your breath. And you may have to do that over and over again. Notice your mind wandering. Ah, there's my mind wandering. And gently return to your breath. There's no right or wrong here. We're just breathing. Our breath grounds us. Our breath sustains us. Our breath gives us life. Know that you can always focus and ground yourself by just focusing on your breath. When you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. Orient yourself back to the room. And just notice what that experience was like. For some, it's hard to focus. Their mind just keeps wandering in different directions. And that's okay. This is practice. Don't add more judgment to that. Just allow yourself to continue to practice, and eventually they will quiet down. For some, they report, oh, that was really relaxing. That's actually not necessarily the goal of mindfulness or mindful breathing, although it is a consequence of it. And with more practice, it can continue to quiet, settle the waters, and you can feel a sense of calm and stillness. So often people will say, I don't have time to practice a whole lot of mindfulness. How do I build that in my work day-to-day life? One response I would say is, all we did right now is breathe for just about 3 or 4 minutes. Can you integrate just 3 or 4 minutes in your day of just getting your stopwatch out, putting your phone off on silent, and just breathe? Don't try to change your breath. Don't try to do anything specific, but just sit and breathe for 3 minutes and see if that kind of helps reset, recharge you, ground you a little bit for you to go into your next activity of the day. There's lots of other ways to incorporate mindfulness into your daily life. You can create some more formal practice like meditation or yoga. They're formal practices of mindfulness. But you don't necessarily have to practice mindfulness and practice meditation and yoga in order to practice mindfulness. You can also incorporate these types of things into your day-to-day life. When you listen to music, you're practicing mindfulness by just sitting and listening to music. But you can incorporate into the things you already do, so you don't have to carve out extra time. Making a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the morning. Most people do that in the morning. And I encourage you, we often go on autopilot in our day, right? And so trying to do that with intention. Try to do that mindfully. Notice, stir your cups, smell the drink, take that first sip mindfully. You can exercise mindfully. You can do breathing exercises like I just did. You can engage mindfulness when you take a shower. So we often are thinking about other things in the shower, and we tend to not do that mindfully. We don't have to create space to do mindfulness. We can do it in our day-to-day life. We can smell a shampoo. We can feel the scrubbing it in our head and what that feels like. We can notice the warm water on our backs. So we can incorporate it into our day-to-day life. We can practice mindfulness doing chores like doing the dishes, just taking pause and noticing the sponge in our hand and on the dish, noticing the smells and the sounds. We can practice mindfulness as we walk to a car. So there's lots of different ways to incorporate it in our life. And there's some great apps out there to incorporate it into your day-to-day life. Calm is one app, Headspace is another. Those are the two go-tos I usually recommend. I prefer Headspace. I kind of like the person's accent, and I can incorporate into shorter sessions of practice, down to 3 minutes even. My daughter, 13-year-old, likes Calm. Those practice, the lowest I think right now is about 10 minutes, but she enjoys those kind of meditation practice. And they also have some audios, kind of sleepy stories that she likes to help her fall asleep. But when you get good at those, you can shift over to Insight Timer, which is another mindfulness app. It's a little overwhelming for first-time users because there's just a lot on it. People can download their own stuff and create their own sort of streams and channels on it. It's kind of a hodgepodge of what you get. So you kind of have to sift through it, but there's a lot on there, podcasts and music and different meditations and things like that. So just a little bit of tips to kind of help you foster your practice. So hopefully I was able to kind of give you a little overview about stress, the impact of stress, how we can look at and manage stress, how we can foster resilience and restoration, and a couple tips to help you to foster your own personal resilience and self-care practice. And we have additional webinars that you can go through that continue that foster that restoration to help you along. So hope that you found that a little bit helpful, and we look forward to seeing you on some of our other webinar series. Thanks so much.